East London called School 21. Stratford was the area where the Olympics took place, and it's all gone through a lot of regeneration, but was typically a kind of East London area that had had a big drain of jobs in recent years. But School 21 is all designed around these idea of kind of real projects, and the things that the students there do in terms of starting from designing their own new school building and meeting with the architects and going through and learning about what it meant to create school designs, and that kind of genuine a project with a very real outcome in that initial case, their school building, is something they've been able to carry through. And what's been really interesting from my perspective is that they've carried it right through to the senior level, where they are working on the kind of mandated exams and they're taking A-levels, and they want the kids to be able to go to university, and most of them will be the first in their families to go. But they've remained committed to that idea that there should be real external audiences. So even though they're studying some mandated curriculum, they're also doing it in a way where then, okay, well, we're going to take this back to our community and teach them about the kinds of things we're learning, because if this history is important enough for us that it's in the national curriculum, then it must be important for other people to learn as well. So I think that sort of commitment to the idea that you can be laying things down for the future, you can be working for your exam results, but at the same time you're a local citizen and you can do something for your community, is that sort of dual focus that I was thinking about earlier.
That's interesting. It reminds me of what you were saying about provocations, Trevor. Like the provocation is almost the place, like where you are, what your community is experiencing can be a provocation in and of itself, and it's probably one of the most real provocations there is, because when you walk out the door of the school, that's where you are. That's really interesting. And I know place-based learning is something that also comes up as a thing where people talk about learn in the place where, use it as a provocation. I'm wondering if either of you have ever seen sort of or attempted sort of place-based learning, or seen any other examples of where place-based learning can offer people like a door into their own passion, or maybe spark a passion that they didn't know existed, or anything like that. Either of you ever seen anything like that?
Well, just speaking to my recent visit to Nelson, and I was just blown away. It's a beautiful, beautiful valley, beautiful corridor, and you see these students getting the spark, as I referred to earlier, from the teachers, taking them outside into the community and working with community groups, and community groups meaning the local bakery or the local bank or the local pharmacy, but also community groups with regards to the Aboriginal peoples in the area, and actually having those authentic collaborative opportunities where the walls of the classroom are taken down and the students are leaving the school to pursue those partnerships. And that takes some incredible leadership, I think. I've been to some amazing schools that have incredible leaders supporting their staff to do amazing things, but I think I've seen incredible teachers do amazing things in spite of the leadership that happens, right? And so I think it starts with the teacher being willing to take students out of the confines of the classroom and find those community partnerships, and Nelson's doing some amazing things.
Yeah, and I think it's wonderful how place is increasingly meaning two things, in that one, you have resources in your community in terms of how kids can learn about the contemporary world and the world of work and be doing community projects that are giving back. And then also place in terms of the natural world and the growing number of programs that are about kids really understanding how local ecosystems work. I'm about to be going up to Cowichan, where they have a trails program that's about laying local trails. They have a land-based program that has a whole range of different ways that high school students are learning about all their local ecosystems. One of the schools we talked about in Thrive was a New Zealand school that actually has a whole campus that's an outdoor campus, and they rotate kids through in kind of small clan groups for a month at a time. So they'll go and stay and they'll camp and they'll learn how to look after themselves and they'll learn how to look after the land. And for kids who are coming from, kind of central Auckland, very urban kids, that's it's a whole different way of learning that you have to design into schools. You can't just expect them to get incidentally.
And really quick, there's a chunk in the New Zealand curriculum that is tied to the specific region that the school is located in. The curriculum changes pocket to pocket to pocket that you go to, and so it really is tied to the land.
Yeah, it would be interesting if we sort of didn't pretend that everything was sort of universal and there was sort of this set of things everyone should know regardless of where they are and who they're with, but actually considered, maybe a little bit about where they actually are. It's interesting when you talked about the New Zealand school. it reminded me right in the Gulf Islands on Saturn Island, there's a ecological education center for high school, and you can go there for a semester or two in your grade 10, 11, or 12 year. And it's the same kind of thing. You parachute in, you go there long days, 12-hour days, 3 days a week. But some kids stay more if they want to just be in the community, and they live there in cabins that are on someone's farm that were created through grant funding and some donations, and they find a community mentor and work on a project that's important to the island, and that's part of their graduation program. Fascinatingly, though, I remember seeing some groups visit there from very, very urban areas, and they would get they have the best ferry dock you've ever seen on Saturn Island. Saturn Island is about 320 full-time residents, and they have the most beautiful ferry dock you've ever seen because a senator used to live there, and well, she still lives there. Actually, she's not a senator anymore, but she still lives there, and it's incredible. So you come to this amazingly industrial, beautiful ferry dock, and then you would see kids go right up to the edge of the paved and concrete dock, and all of a sudden the road gets a little bit bumpy, and there's grass and trees and pine needles and turkey vultures walking up to you, and they're scared. It's like a scary experience, and I always think that's also a shame. Thinking back to what you were saying about people saying I don't have any passions, it's like people saying I'm afraid of the natural world. It just takes we have to reintroduce people to these things sometimes.
And that's the learning I want for my children. I want my children, they'll learn Shakespeare and they'll learn the 5-paragraph essay, but I want my boys to have, an authentic mentor that's going to walk them through the ups and downs of some real life learning. And I think about the learning objectives, EduSpeak, tied to that process and how meaningful that was for those students. And that's going to set them off with some really powerful tools into, quote unquote, the real world.
So that kind of brings me to part of my next question, which is, in that program, a lot of the learning people were doing was very hard to kind of give it a name and put it into one of the boxes that we've created. So I remember one boy, he learned how to be a coxswain on a Spanish longboat. He learned how to circumnavigate the island, and then led a group of other people in a longboat around the island, and they mapped it while they were doing it. They also did a naval exercise with the Canadian Navy that was parked just off the edge of the island there, and it was quite an incredible piece of learning. And then when it went to credential what he was doing, there wasn't anything, and it ended up being credentialed as an independent studies in physical education. And so on his transcript, it looked like he really, really, really liked PE, and he does, but it really didn't tell you anything about his experience. So I guess my next question is sort of about we talk about all these things, and typically, almost all the things we've talked about so far, everybody nods and they smile and they wish for it and they have examples of it. But I know that sometimes our metrics don't have anything to do with that. What should we be doing, or what should we be telling people when they see a set of metrics that seems to be completely opposite to the direction that it sounds like most people would like to go? How do we handle that?
So I think this is where things get really exciting, because there are more and more examples percolating and coming through of schools that have essentially created their own transcript, diploma, whatever one wants to call it, that just looks very different. And it will still have some of the same core subjects, because it has to fit into the boxes of the other thing, and because some of the knowledge there is things that we want to lay down for everyone. But there's a school in the US, and actually their students have created a whole magazine about them, so there's great stuff online telling all the story. But they have a kind of innovation diploma, which at the moment is just an opt-in, but the students in it they use a badging system called Credly, which is a new platform in the States that is spreading, trying to spread internationally. And on Credly, you can create badges, which then someone else has to sort of accredit. So someone else verifies that you've done what you say. You upload something to demonstrate what you've done, and you write the description of what it is. So the badge will come under something the school has sort of decided. So digital leadership is one of the examples they talk about. But then you will describe exactly what you did to demonstrate your digital leadership. And so for that, you can tailor it to something that's just a little bit more specific, that the school has decided these are some of the things that we care about. And then you, even within that, can kind of personalize it even more, so that when you're trying to communicate to other people what you've done, you have something that's kind of externally verified, and just describes in much more concrete terms, what you've really done.
So in that jurisdiction, they have the freedom to create a transcript, even to graduate from high school. The whatever the state or whatever it is hasn't said it needs to look like this. They've given them that freedom.
Yeah, so they've used the kind of maximum amount of flex they can in terms of there's still the required courses in there, but then this innovation diploma is essentially all the electives bundled up into this extra bit they can do. And then it's the working with colleges to help them understand. So the transcript is very carefully designed to communicate what the innovation diploma is and what goes into it.
That's very interesting. I have to look that one up right after this. So, any thoughts on that
I
one?
think transparency is key, and I think when we're asking others to consider change, the other side of that chasm of change can be pretty uncertain and overwhelming for our colleagues or our friends to consider, and so I think transparency is really important. And what I mean by that is really giving our friends a lens into what our assessment looks like and what it is that is happening in our classroom. And just a brief story of a student I taught back at the beginning of my career named Garrison, and Garrison was really disconnected from school, and finally in the 11th hour I discovered his passion, his lone interest in life was graffiti art, and he took me to his graffiti art in Esquimalt, and we hiked over these railroad tracks, and an entire abandoned warehouse was his art, and I was blown away. I was blown away because it was beautiful and because he had been doing this behind my back for years and I had no idea, and I was blown away because I saw symbolism and I saw metaphor and I saw a theme, all those things in our English class that I hadn't seen for the years that I taught Garrison. And so for the rest of the year, Garrison, it was graffiti art 100% of the time. So rather than Hamlet, it was graffiti art. Rather than a persuasive essay, it was a persuasive essay to the mayor of Esquimalt trying to convince her to legalize graffiti art in some of our public spaces. And so when I say transparency, my colleagues and my leadership, they want to know what my assessment looked like and how Garrison was doing going to meet the requirements of, or how that all my other students were meeting as well. And I go back to you really quickly, Jeff. Recently a parent of a student at SAI showed me their report card, and it was amazing to see what it looks like. I finally had this lens into the teacher side and the parent side of what assessment looks like, and I think transparency ticks so many boxes of getting to that change that we're asking our colleagues to embark on.
That's interesting. I thanks to both of you for that. And when you talk about transparency, and then I hear about this sort of making your own credential, which I find really exciting. I remember meeting Alan, and I forgot his last name, the principal at Cydia's school. Remember that great place? Yeah. Like bow down. Also introduced me to Chromecast, and was like, yes. There, I remember asking him, like, how do your kids do on your exams and they have regent exams in New York State, or in New York City actually. They're set by the city as sort of a final threshold over which you must pass to sort of make sure you really did something while you were breathing the air and occupying the space in the schools. And because that's the only other measure they had was actually you're there. That was incredible. And he said, we don't really care. I was just like, what? And so his metric was several years after that, which is, where are they ending up? How are they doing? How happy are they? How are they thriving? Do they feel like what we did was helping them get to where they wanted to be as people? And I just remember that was like quite a profound answer. And I thought, wow, it must be great to not have to care about that, but to have something to replace it. And so when we talk about transparency, I'm wondering, have you experienced that most, I don't know whether it's political leaders or bureaucratic leaders or a bit of both, how do they respond to saying, could we consider a more authentic measure of how we're doing? Like, could we dump these little things and kind of move on to something bigger and better? Have you ever run across that conversation or had a really great one or a really terrible one?
I've tried to have it. I've tried to have it in a number of different places. And the frustrating thing is there are definitely system leaders everywhere who completely understand the need to move in that direction. And yet when they're stuck somewhere, responsible for thousands, tens of thousands, in somewhere like New York City, like 1 million kids, you can't get that same level of trust to be confident about moving in a direction of something where you're going to have that same level of transparency. And I think that's where technology may help. I do think that badging systems can move us some of the way because they can help with sort of securing some of the intermediaries that can so you can get the transparency going at a large scale. But I think it's also about educators pushing back and understanding that system leaders are in a very particular position. There's a great book called Seeing Like a State, which is now a good 30 years old probably, but is about just what happens in governments in terms of the natural sort of spread towards rationalizing everything, trying to standardize everything, because you're just trying to get information. And in order to get information at scale, you have to end up standardizing it. But if we know that that's not necessarily the best thing for education, for learning, it's not necessarily capturing everything we want for our kids, then it has to be educators who push back against that and say, like, hold up, like, you're here to help us make the system work. But if you're dictating everything that happens in classrooms, then the tail is wagging the dog. So I do think people have to become much more braver, really, about pushing back. And there are some systems, and I would say in BC, I think there's more room than one thinks. And in some schools and in some districts, people are starting to push and find actually you can push a pretty long way before they push back. So I think there's a good way to go there.
Oh, that's interesting. I like the pushing back. Yes, and that I forgot about that book. I think I did read that actually a long time ago. I'm gonna read that again. Have you experienced that? Like, and does the transparency ever require you to push back? Like, have you ever found the system or like the man kind of trying to prevent you, even when you're being very transparent about what you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a really clear example is at the end of English 12, we've got a big provincial exam. It's worth 40% of our students' marks, and inevitably once those exam marks, I know ew, right? Yeah. And inevitably what the conversation happens the next year is, are your class marks very different than the exam marks? And they should, and the conversation should go, well, they should be pretty close to one another, shouldn't it? If you've done your job in the classroom, you've prepared your students for the exam. And if they have 86 in the class, they should be close to 86 in the class. And we know what happens when students get into a setting like that. And no matter how well you prepare them for the anxieties around performing and the standardized assessment, there are going to be pieces that we can't control. And there are going to be pieces on the assessment tool that are faulty. It's not an accurate representation of what students are capable of. Most recently, my students are doing these passion presentations, is what they call them. And what's been really neat is when we're building our criteria for a presentation, the first thing students want to know is, how long is the presentation? How long do you want it to be? 2 minutes, 5 minutes? And I've taken time off the table. I've said it can be as long or as short as you'd like it to be. And you could just see the anxiety melt away off their shoulders. As soon as time is taken off the table, amazing things happen. And what I mean by amazing things, the bell has gone and my students don't leave the class. They're sitting there listening to each other speak. They've lost track of time. And you've done a beautiful job of that at your school, taking time off the table. And that's a metaphor for changing those structures and changing that bell schedule. And those are big changes, but as you are with your travels, you see these changes happening around the world. These are questions that are global, and we do have an incredible amount of freedom with our BC curriculum. Whenever I go away, I'm so thankful to come back, not just for our curriculum and for my colleagues, but for our students. Our students are pretty darn amazing here in British Columbia. And I love that you said that, it happens within. It doesn't have to start with leadership. It can start with an amazing teacher doing something really special with their students. And going back to something I said earlier, in that I've seen amazing leaders lead staff and schools to amazing places, but the most innovative things I've seen come from teachers themselves. In spite of the leadership that's happening, or in spite of what's going on in the district, it starts with the teacher in inquiry and learning with the students. And no matter what structures we adopt or how we change the schedule or how we try to rejig what it is that we do 9 to 5, it comes down to the teacher in inquiry with their students.
Yeah, it's interesting when you put those two things together. I think about different leadership styles where a leader has an idea and then tries to make everybody fulfill it, and the other kind where you look for the incredible things people are doing and try to help them do it. So that it shouldn't be despite the leadership. It should be, the leadership isn't the thing that started the idea, but it should be, the point of leadership should be to help people have an easier time of it, like knock down some walls for them. But hearing you both say almost in the same words that, there's a lot of room to push in BC, and there's a lot of there's a lot more farther that you know BC can go and teachers could go. I have to admit, and I don't want to be sort of negative about this, but I do think that I'm not sure that we have pushed, and I'm not sure that we have taken advantage of all the space that is available. So, and when you talk about things like time and just how we structure a person's day and those sorts of things, well short of anything that's legislated, there's some traps that we seem to have set for ourselves. And I'm wondering if you think that there are reasons besides just the power of the status quo that are kind of keeping people trapped in those things, or if they are actually, if there's a reason why people are doing them. Is there something that's, I guess, preventing people from, based on all the research and personal experience and everything and the things that people grumble about in staff rooms especially, that why don't we just not do those things anymore if they're not required? What do you think stops people?
Well, not to be too much of a fearmonger, but the fear of chaos, right? You know, my building, I have 1,400 students in my building, and when you talk about taking time off the table, and we have structured in an hour every single day, and it's called focus block, but forgive me, it's almost like open office hours. So our students can go to any space in the entire school to work with any teacher on any piece of their learning they'd like to explore for that hour. And to track 1,400 kids with that much freedom, it kind of hurts the brain just for a second, doesn't it? And side note, we had 3 students 3 years ago design an attendance software platform to track our students through this chaos. It was amazing. Students actually solved the problem of the mess, the worry, the concern. But what we've seen in that little hour is that not only are students on task for the most part, and that's a broad stroke, but they want more time. They say they use it so well, they're able to get things done, quote unquote, so that they can get to practice or rehearsal after school, so they can get to their families, so they can eat at home, have a dinner with their parents. That one block of time is used so powerfully. You know, I'd love to see what they do with 2 hours or 3 hours, or maybe I host a tutorial for 150 students in a room like this, and then the next hour is in breakout groups according to their passion or their curiosity or their needs. And just rethinking how we can facilitate the 1,400 kids, I think that's some cognitive friction in the systems that we've of course nurtured over the years. But as you've seen, there are pockets of this happening around the world. You know, we don't need to rejig or reinvent the wheel. There are people doing this, and we just have to go outside to come back in, go outside to come back in. And that's why it's great to collaborate with people who have seen schools, and that's my pitch to you. I'm sure you've seen this around the world, haven't you?
Yeah, but I think one of the challenges of moving from schools to systems is just all of the interdependencies. So, you know, systems are designed to have these relatively tight interdependencies about how does transport work, how do we decide when a whole load of people move up the year or not. And so because they for such a long time, pick just one piece is incredibly difficult. And so this is why I think we've seen some success with creating schools that can be the new units to show how do we get the interpersonal part of this to work, because that's as hard as anything else. Is kids don't know sort of social scripts of how to behave in a different way in school, what to do when they get to increase in freedom. Adults need to figure out how to work in a different way with people. So if we get that working at the school, then at least people start to see, okay, so that works, that's possible, that's how people behave, that's what it looks like. And then it's a sort of network effect system thinking problem, which, you know, people have to work out in a whole different way at the system level.
That's interesting when you talk about the interdependencies. I remember trying to change a school hours one time at a school, and it was the biggest network of mess you've ever seen. And I remember actually saying in the meeting, it seems to me that we must have built the schools where we did because buses were already driving around the community and stopping at these barren locations. And we thought, you know what? Because the buses are stopping, we should build a school here. And it should start at the time that the buses are arriving, because it seemed like that was driving everything.
They can't go anywhere else.
It was unbelievable. And even the 1,400, I think about that and I think, you know, it may be a good idea to have 1,400 people in a building, but maybe it isn't. And how did we decide that was a good idea to have gigantic groups of people together? And not that that's a gigantic group exactly, but it's maybe bigger than, like if it creates a problem of doing something that seems like a good way to learn, without having to be really, really creative, maybe we shouldn't have 1,400 people in a building.
And I thrive coming to a building that's so alive and has that energy. But I just met with a student last week with his mother, and he was talking about his social anxiety and how it's keeping him from school. And now we've got the iPad set up at the back of the room for the next couple of weeks so he can chime in from home and watch and have that slow reentry. And I've learned how to be really aware of the students' needs and how to rethink how we could have them be a part of the learning environment, to check those boxes so attendance doesn't, look bad on the report card, but more importantly, so they can feel connected to their community. They could see their friends and they could be a part of something special.
Well, I think it's also a question about priorities. So the only way you start to break through those interdependencies is when something else becomes a priority. And then you suddenly find that there are solutions to these problems. So even buses, there's a community classroom up in Duncan who, because the whole class had been shaped around our priority is to be able to do these projects out in the community, and they still do everything else as well, but they've just reoriented. And then they're like, okay, we're going to need every kid to have a bike. So our first project has to be about fixing bikes so that we can then go out on our bikes and do everything else that we need to do in the community, and we don't have to rely on the bus system. And so once you've shifted, okay, what are we really going to make a priority, not what are we going to try and fit around the edges, it does become possible.
Very good, thank you. Well, so we've got about 10 minutes left, and we've called this a, pardon me. Yeah. The one question was really just going to be, I was thinking this is called a fireside chat. We don't have a fire. I'm really disappointed, but I think UVic frowns upon that, and it really adds to your insurance policy that when you rent the room. But I guess normally in a fireside chat, I wouldn't be asking you questions and you'd be answering them. So I was going to just ask you if you each had sort of something that you thought needed saying that was maybe a provocation somewhere through our conversation that you thought you wanted to say about either anything that we've talked about, metrics, thriving, and we've talked a lot about high school, and I don't know whether we should talk a little bit about youngers, like what I know sometimes there's pushback down age-wise. I've heard grade 1 teachers say, well, fun and games are over. Kindergarten was last year. We got to get you ready because you're going to be heading into grade 4 pretty soon, a couple of years. And then in grade 4, they're like, well, you're going to be going to middle school pretty soon, so fun and games are over. Sorry, you got to start sitting at a desk and reading and writing. And then the same thing in middle school where oh well, you're going to be in high school, so you have to stop. You're not a child anymore. I'm sorry. You'll have to start being a teenager right now. That's just one thought, but don't let that, that's just what was going on in my mind. And
no, I love it. And, a personal connection to that is my youngest son, Gregor. He's in kindergarten this year, so he's 5. He turns 6 in a few months. And Gregor has been working. We've had a speech and language pathologist working with some of his sounds, and some of his sounds have been slowly coming over the last couple of years. And every week, Gregor gets some pull-out support from the school district speech and language pathologist, and it is always during what the teacher calls Genius Hour. And Genius Hour is that free space for our youngs to build and to play. And so we had our student-led conferences a month ago, and the teacher turned to my son Gregor, and she said, Gregor, what's one thing that you'd like to see change for our last trimester here? And my son said, well, every time I get support, and this is my 5-year-old son, I'm missing Genius Hour, and I don't want to miss Genius Hour. And it broke our heart because he's such a gritty learner, and I mean that in every sense of the word grit. Like, he sticks with things and he gets dirty in learning. And this is his 1 hour that I see him being able to get out of the seat and move around and get into his learning. And I do believe in the value of literacy and numeracy at the younger years. Like, those are foundational blocks for a lifelong, learning, I guess you could say, portfolio, but it's not at the risk of my son's curiosities and interests and passions. And something does happen. I referred to it earlier. Something does happen where our students become more complacent and more consumption rather than creation. And I aim to do something differently about that, of course, in my work in supporting schools and adopting inquiry. And I think it starts with their questions and their curiosities, and having those questions and curiosities lead to learning moments. An inquiry mentor of mine, Kath Murdoch, out of Australia, she told me a beautiful story a few months ago, and it was she was observing a teacher who had designed this amazing provocation and lesson, and she was really excited for Kath to see it because Kath was her mentor, and she was delivering it for the students, and the students were all looking out the window, and she was trying her best to get their attention. They were all staring at something across the roadway. And when the teacher looked out the window, there was a construction crew that was tearing down a house. And rather than stand in front of the window and close the blinds and say, me, my lesson, my lesson, my lesson, she saw the provocation, she saw the spark, and she took the learning to where the students' interests were. And for the next month, it was all there, quite literally. You know, in that moment, the students, she rolled out notepads and what do you call it? Well, not just pens and paper, but the clipboards, and they all went outside and they did sketches and they took notes, and these were grade 2s. And then they interviewed the construction workers and the foremen. They came back in over the month. They designed little shoebox houses, literacy, numeracy, design thinking. It was beautiful stuff. And I spoke to a gentleman earlier about what is the disposition of the teacher that had the character and strength and confidence to let that happen, to see the opportunity outside and let go of the hard work we put in the lesson and see that the student's interest was outside. And so it does come down to prioritizing, rejigging what we think is the hierarchy of how we meet our students' needs. And you know, I used to joke around, wouldn't it be neat if empathy was a learning objective? And now it is. It is. Empathy is a learning objective. And I think that's a huge shift globally, is that we're looking at the whole student and not just the retention of facts and consumption of learning. We are creating these creators and these empathetic human beings, and it is a beautiful global change.
I think the question of kind of developmental trajectories is really important, because on the one hand, you know, yes, like an 18-year-old is very different from a 5-year-old, and you want to be doing different things with them. But there is something about that, preparing them for what comes later. But I think we have to ask seriously, you know, what we're then preparing them for, because it's relatively easy to sit at a desk and listen or pretend to listen or write when you're told to, or kind of pretend to write when you're told to. Like we can all learn to do that pretty quickly. You do not need 13 years to practice that skill. But what is much harder is like working with other people to produce something that's going to be meaningful to an external audience. So that's the thing I think we can start practicing from when you're 5 years old, is what that actually looks like.
That's interesting. So if we thought about this is what you're going to need later on, it could be things like compassion and empathy and collaboration and all of those things, and not learning how to sit at a desk and pretend to write. Very interesting. Thank you. I think the real hosts would like to give people an opportunity to ask some questions. If you guys are up for that for a few minutes, you're okay? Okay. Yeah, I know. That's what I'm watching. I think she's doing well.
You know what? I have to remind myself of the name of the school, because I want to say it's Mount Vernon, but I think that is because now I'm thinking of Vernon, which is the... So, but I will... Yes, you definitely can. Yes.
Sure, I'll just reiterate the question so I understand what you're saying about the bottleneck that occurs when we're trying to do all of these competency-based and personalized things, and then there are a couple of points at which it all comes down to sort of a matter of efficiency, particularly things like people graduating and people entering post-secondary, where there may only be an opportunity to just look at a transcript of grades, for example, and maybe not see a whole person. Is that sort of the nature of your question? And what anyone has been seen done about that, or your experience with that?
Well, first, I have faith that those conversations are happening between K-12 and higher ed, and they're happening between UVic and our local, our Ministry of Education here in British Columbia. And I know teachers that are part of those conversations, and that's really inspiring to know that those authentic connections are being made. However, as we know with change, it's going to take years. And so in the inquiry classroom, I do a lot of self-assessment with my students, and what I mean by that is my students have a voice in the assessment process and practice, and it's just not throwing numbers into a computer and a percentage is spit back out to us. There are many student-led conferences where the two of us are chatting about their learning throughout the year, and when you see that rich body of learning take shape over a year, the number is irrelevant. And what I mean by that is we know it's really relevant. We know how much it matters. For some of our students, when we're talking scholarships, the difference of 2% is thousands of dollars. So when I mean it by it being relevant, my students can essentially pick that percentage when they've shown me a breadth of work that warrants that range. So when a student says, I want 98%, and their body of work is robust and full and rich, they can have the 98%. Because how powerful is my assessment practice 3 years ago that I could tell the difference between 98% and 96? It was the computer that was telling me the difference between those two pieces. Yeah.
Yeah, I think on the one hand, it's being strategic about the things that matter and the things that don't. You know, these bottlenecks are real still at the moment, and so one has to understand them. I'm a big believer in the fact that if you really want something, studying, you know, you're going to be studying for it in your own time, and that most of the kinds of tests that unfortunately are still gateway tests are ones that you study for, and it's going to be most useful studying in your own time. And then it's not letting it take over the whole process, because at the end of the day, after you get through that bottleneck, you still have to be able to live a full adult life. And unfortunately, I've seen too many peers, and been through parts of this where everything has become about working towards some bottleneck, and you get out the other side, and whether you've been successful or not, it's this sudden feeling of then now who am I? Like, what do I mean again? Like, what do I care about? And so if you lose that thread at that crucial stage of when people are forming their identity as young people becoming adults, that can be lifelong damage. So it's maintaining perspective, I guess.
Just to add one more thing to that, Jen Unwin, who's working in British Columbia with the Ministry of Education, trying to bridge the K-12 to the post-secondary, she's been having these conversations with universities, and interestingly, I've been involved in a few of those, and a few of them have said, UVic and UBC particularly have said, we have a whole machinery that's built to sort of function in a particular way using a particular set of metrics. They said we probably have the horsepower to do something that's completely different. The is in the change. So in the year if they made the transition, and Kwantlen Polytechnic is starting to make that change now. So they're doing a pilot with Surrey School District where learners are entering their university without any marks. They're not looking at any transcript marks at all. They're only looking at competencies and indicators of those competencies in a portfolio. So they're leading the way, and everyone's watching very carefully, because right now it is a buyer's market. You might have heard that term, institutional bypass, and a lot of the kids that I know are looking at colleges and universities and saying, maybe, maybe not, and I might do one thing over there, or maybe one thing over there, and they're really being able to be a little bit more choosy than they have been in the past, because it's really a buyer's market right now. Yeah. How are we doing for time, you guys? I guess we should get a few more minutes, okay? Yeah, oh yeah, there's a... So I'll just reiterate the question here for the web people. I think you're asking that when kids are looking for those grades, and that's what they're focused on and oriented to, how and do we shift that maybe priority or view of learning from the grades to something deeper and some of the things we've been talking about? Is that a fair way to ask it?
Yeah, a couple things come to mind with your question, and the first is scaffolding. You know, our students have learned to play a certain game, and they've learned to play it really, really well, and now we're flipping that game on its head. And you know, on day one, you know, I really try to honor what I'm asking them to commit to. And I honor that by being very clear with my intent, modeling my curiosities and my passions are big questions for the year, but also talking quite clearly about how this will be a different year for them and they're going to have a much more meaningful role in their learning. And then slowly over the first few weeks, they start to see that take shape in some really tangible pieces. You know, a really quick example is used to hand out a course outline, a syllabus, and it was that really proud moment in my photocopying where I had all my piles on all my courses and I'd hand it out, and then it got home and parents would sign it, and now I don't do any of that. We co-design that syllabus, and so we talk about the big objectives of the year, we talk about our big goals, and then they backfill the rest with their passions and their curiosities and their questions. And even that takes scaffolding. Even that is a big ask for our students because they're so used to, wait a sec, the clarity, where's the pathway? I don't see the pathway. And so I slow things down, talk about time, taking time off the table. You know, Garrison is a great example. I used to ask students like Garrison to give me 10 essays a year, and Garrison taught me that I only need one. Like, I don't need to see 10 essays or 20 essays or 30 essays. I just need to see one example of your best. And by slowing down and really allowing students to be in their learning, I think that helps with those anxieties around what's my mark? What's my mark? And that change is not going to happen overnight. You know, they've been a part of this structure and these processes for years. And so to rejig their language around learning, that's going to take time.
I would just add that I've always been really mean to my students, even when I kind of taught in the old-fashioned way. I just hated that. Story used to really bother me, and so people would say, how long does this essay need to be? And I would always say, as long as a piece of string. And they would all go, they would all like rise, be like, oh, how long does it need to be? And they would, and also, you know, I would say, what's this test out of? And I would say, 7,000. And they'd just be like, what? And it's like, it doesn't matter what it's out of because it's all about how, anyway. And just play with them a little bit to try to break them out of that. But it really is about scaffolding and also trust. And if they feel like what you're going to do is authentic and legitimate, as long as what they're doing is being recognized, and it's being recognized properly, they feel pretty good about it, but it does take time. I guess last thing I would say is, part of it is about helping them focus on learning instead of production. When you're talking about like kind of consumer school, we're trying really hard to get out of a production consumption paradigm and try to get into a learning paradigm. You're actually here to learn. You're not here to work, although work is probably one of the things you're going to do to learn. And you're not here to necessarily produce something, although you may produce things that are indicators of learning. You're here to learn. That's your job. And so as soon as you can help people think that way, it does begin to make the mark part seem a little weird. And then it starts to become a negotiation, which is, well, what kind of mark do you want? Well, here's the kind of thing you're going to have to do. Okay. And then it's the other way around.
A fun shortcut to that, when I was a master's student, one of my very first classes, this was at Harvard, and so everyone had come in feeling a bit, A students, all this stuff. We just all got D's the semester because they were like, by the standards of what's known about science and education, like, you're all about here. And it was a term, and then like the finals ended up a little different because they understand that transcripts are important for later stages and stuff. But depending on, what's attached to it and whether it's something that will at least give people a jolt and move into that thing of, okay, like, what am I actually learning? Like, let's focus on that, because if you take away that emotional attachment to getting a good grade by just not giving them a good grade, then they have to become emotionally attached to something else.
Yeah, really. I've actually taken grades off a lot of my feedback, and so my students are doing these past presentations, and I just write comments consistently as they're presenting. I'm going to attach a number or a letter grade to that, and I just give them the feedback, and then they revisit, and we have a follow-up. Okay, well, what grade do you think this warrants? Where do you think you are on the spectrum? And the feedback from the students is, it really freaked me out that I didn't see the grade. Like, that really, I had to sleep with that. Like, oh my gosh. And then they come back and they look at the feedback and, wow, you talked about how kind my energy was, or how subtly confident I was. That meant so much to me. Thank you. And again, talking about empathy and the whole student. taking the number off the table and then looking at the feedback as the start point allows us to get to a number that they are more connected to in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I'm always reminded of the doctor's visit. If you went in to get a full exam by your doctor and you said, "So doctor, how am I doing?" And he said, like, 83. It would be ridiculous, not right. But somehow we think education is a place where you could say 83. And I just don't understand why we're still doing that. It doesn't make any sense. So, but it's definitely, there are people oriented that way. I think I will turn it back over to you guys, or do you want me to, okay, I will. More. So just to reiterate again, so if kids are doing fine in the current system, what would be the risk of just leaving it like that? Why would they want to stray from that system? What would be the incentive, maybe even move, and why would you push them? Right. What's the danger of not, or why are we doing this? Why are we trying to make change? Okay. 83. Yeah.
No pressure. I think good, this sounds really airy-fairy, but so forgive me, but I think good is the enemy of great. And I think we've learned how to do things really, really well in the structures that we've gone through. I had a good experience in school, and my post-secondary work and my grad studies, they've been good. But I don't feel like that's good enough for my children anymore. So forgive me. My son is so curious and so empathetic, and I just don't want those characteristics to water down in him. And I think when we look at the whole child as one side of the reason why we should push back, but also when we look at the world of tomorrow, and the world of tomorrow, as you said, is not a world where students are going to be able to sit at a desk and pretend that they're typing and pretend that they're listening. They are going to have to, and this sounds so cliche saying it because it's being said so in many circles around the world, but it's so true. They're going to have to create, and they're going to have to problem solve, and they're going to have to collaborate, and they're going to have that authentic connection to the drive, the motivation, and too many years I've seen students who have disconnected from their learning, and it not only breaks my heart, but I see where they end up, and they don't end up with fulfilling, meaningful learning opportunities in their future. And so, the whole child, but also the world of tomorrow, I think those are my two reasons why I push back.
Yeah, I think we're just sleepwalking into a bit of a disaster in terms of mental health and in terms of the planet. I think we have to change, and change is incredibly hard. It's not what we're designed to do. We're designed to institutionalize things and carry on doing the same. But we just know that that's not sustainable. It's not sustainable because too many of us are feeling disconnected and unhappy, and too many young people can't form relationships and can't figure out what their place is in this world that is increasingly confusing because there's so much around them about what's going on. And we need to change how we live and how we live sustainably. So that has to start with schools, and that means schools have to change too.
I would just add, I had a company, an agency in China who contacted me and said, could we send you 250 children next year? And we only have 85 kids in our school. I said, no. You could maybe send 2. And I said, what? Like, why? And they said, well, we're starting an inquiry program. This was just outside of Shanghai. And they were saying, we have an inquiry program, and our kids are going to be going into an entrepreneurship incubator. And we wanted them to come and experience a year or 2 of inquiry learning, because they're going to be going into this entrepreneurship incubator where it's going to be all based on building collaboration, creativity, and this is going to be happening in most of the major cities. And so I'm thinking, holy cow. So I said, so wow, so 250? And he goes, no, there's going to be 25,000 kids doing this. We want to send 250 to you. So I think tomorrow is now. I think we need to start thinking about what the world needs right now and how our kids are going to participate in it. I feel like we might be already having to catch up a little bit as a country. I worry about that a little bit. So